Welcome Internet. Today I'm going to be talking about one of those topics that is a major source of anxiety both for patients and for therapists. And this topic is the topic of mistakes. And here I'm going to talk about the mistakes made by therapists. So let me start by saying that this is not going to be one of those hit pieces where I basically go on a rant on what is wrong with psychotherapists, what we do wrong, why we make mistakes, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to attack anyone here. I'm even going to take the flip side of saying that mistakes are not just inevitable, they're necessary. So this might be very controversial to state that, but I'm going to try and explain why. So there are three types of mistakes I feel that a therapist might do. A first level of mistake is on the setting. For example, you marked an appointment and you forgot about it and you get 2 patients instead of 1 and you have to deal with the fallout. The second level of in that same level is, for example, let's say you have to cancel an appointment because something has broken down in the office and you have to get it fixed. Sometimes you fall ill and so on and so forth. So those are little sins that often don't impact that much the relationship when they're very, very sporadic. But sometimes the mistake is still made by the therapist, in which, for example, in the first case that I was giving where you book 2 patients in the same schedule, well, that's all new, right? And there might be reasons, and I'm not saying that they're not, but that's a mistake. But often patients are very welcoming. They're not going to judge you too much because there is that tacit understanding that the therapist is human. Even though he is a therapist, he still has limits and he still is basically subject to a whole range of events in his life, right? We are no gods, right? So if something is amiss, it does happen and often we have to roll with it. So the second level is a mistake in interpretations. Those mistakes are often you don't make the right interpretations, or the interpretations are off, or you just have some issue within you, be it because of countertransference, i.e. what the patient brings, or even like you are worried with your own problems, but you can't really listen to the patient. Therefore, you're more prone to making mistakes. Those mistakes often occur, and when they occur, the patient might feel a sense of vexation. You might also get personal events wrong with certain patients, or even forget some sins. All of these are sins that happen semi-regularly, right? You can't avoid them. Even though you might be very thorough, you might take notes, you might do a whole range of stuff that diminishes the risk. We still, as therapists, remain very, very human. And often these mistakes are perhaps more aggravating for patients because they might feel that you're not listening to them, or you're not paying attention, or that they're wasting their money with you, or in case of let's say a hospital setting or an institutional setting, they might feel that you're just churning in people but not really paying attention, and so on and so forth. So that's on the level of an interpretation or the not remembering certain events. There's a third form of mistake that I see commonly among my own circles and the world of French psychotherapy is an emotional mistake. The therapist might sometimes act in a certain way, thinking it's going to create a dynamic in which the patient is going to be able to grow, but it stunts the development of the patient and there might be regression. So that form of emotional mistake is often something that starts with the best intent but kind of fails because it backfires and the patient then starts having iatrogenic, i.e. side effects through that emotional stance. It can be being too cold with a patient that on the contrary needs a form of, how can I say, Rogerian understanding, i.e. an unconditional positive regard, and he gets coldness. It can be, on the contrary, someone that's needs limits because they invade the setting with questions in regards to the privacy of the therapist. And the therapist, instead of putting a limit that is, of course, always benevolent but necessary, instead answers those questions, and very, very personal questions, things that they would not want to answer but feel forced to answer. So there's a lot of dimensions to mistakes, and mistakes are not something that are, how can I say, so easily handled, because often they hurt the trust the patient has towards a therapist. Because even though the patient might very well consciously know that the therapist is just another human, that we are as prone as everyone else to make mistakes, there is this unconscious expectations that we might be better than that we might be a cut above. Often I feel that mistakes are necessary, and that's what I was saying at the start of the video. So necessary in what way? Well, it's necessary because it does give a new perspective and a new opportunity. Every mistake sends back inevitably anyone and everyone to previous mistakes made by environment, by the family, by the colleagues or the comrades when they're children, friends, lovers, and so on and so forth. So a mistake reopens. It's like a Pandora's box. It reopens something, right? And this is where it becomes important, if you're able to correct the mistake, then there is something very important that happens for the patient, because the patient then understands that A, it's not their fault, that someone else can take their responsibilities. It's not upon them to always take on responsibility when it's not their actions. And three, there's no retaliation. The therapist is not going to get angry, they're not going to lash out, they're going to acknowledge the perspective of the patient and acknowledge their error. And in doing so, it creates a perception in which the therapist becomes more reliable. So when we fix mistakes, when we acknowledge them and fix them, and we don't repeat them, what is happening is that we're showing the patient that the relationship, the professional relationship, can survive the impact of imperfection. To put it simply, basically you make a mistake and it's okay. There's no great fallout, there's no explosion, the relationship is going to survive. And you have to, and this is important as a therapist, you have to take ownership of your mistakes. Meaning that, for example, if you forgot a patient, well, you have to apologize deeply. And of course, this seems obvious, but you still have to do it. You tell them that to not pay the session, that session is not to be paid. Likewise, if you come late, you can offer a compromise of like, I came 20 minutes late, this type of discounts can be applied to the session. I think all of these things can be talked about with the patient. And as long as things are discussed, they create a space in which the patient can then basically learn from handling those mistakes from the therapist themselves. That through the reaction of the therapist that de-dramatizes, that lowers the capacity for impact of mistakes, restructures them, reframes them, it is an opportunity for both patient and therapist to grow as people, that we're showing them that a mistake can be fixed. So here it might be very important to say, well, yes, but some therapists abuse their patients or insult them or mock them. For me, and this is going to be my personal take, those aren't mistakes, they're abuse. So the very clear difference I'm going to make is that a mistake is something that happens, but in a very, very specific way, that it's an error. Like something that has slipped your attention, or you just unconsciously, something came forward and you had to deal with it, or just a life event that you couldn't postpone, right? That's a mistake, right? Something that just is not of your will. Abuse, according to me, is much more willing And when the therapists abuse their patients, that's no mistake. They basically are replaying their patterns in a semi-conscious way, obviously, but still, there is a choice there. Because in every abusive relationship I've read about a therapist or a patient, it became apparent that the therapist knew quite well what they were doing. That it's not like, oh, I should not have done that, or oh, I let my unconscious mind slip, and oh, I really shouldn't. That's the mistake. That moment where you're like, oh, no, I think I made a mistake. Abusing someone is not a mistake. The therapists, especially those who have been trained in psychodynamics, know precisely what they're doing. So when, for example, Masood Khan, let's say, says goodbye to one of his patients, opens a taxi door, and says to them, have you ever thought about committing suicide? Goodbye. He knows perfectly what's happening. He's creating a point of anxiety in the patient in which he's going to have to handle by themselves. Something that is not just, I made a stupid remark at the end of the session. No, it becomes a very clear point of Masood Khan wanted the patient to feel anxiety. And that's abuse. So abuse is very, very different in my eyes. A mistake is something that is fixable and understandable and rekindles a mutual sense of humanity in both parties. Abuse is something that aims at evacuating a feeling of frustration and rage and sometimes excitement onto the patient. So in a case, we have something in which it's part and parcel of humanity and relationships, and something that isn't. So we might also frame it on the fact that the mistake is something that creates a path for development. Abuse cuts off development. Nothing can be made of abuse, because even people that rekindle and restructure themselves out of an abusive relationship have suffered. They have maybe grown, but it's not thanks to the abuse. It's thanks to all the help that they got afterwards or during the crisis, which helped them out of it. It did not strengthen their characters. What strengthened their characters is all the love and care that they received. The fact that someone was saying, you can make it out of it. When there's abuse, the aim is not for the person to grow. The aim is just the destructive element. Whereas mistakes don't carry the same destruction. They carry just the intricacies of human life. And I also think that in terms of interpretations, and I'll one day make a video on the question of interpretations, but interpretations themselves make for a good trial and error, because you might get a lot of things wrong, but as long as the patient can reflect upon them, can understand that it's a mistake, that mistake opens the possibility of something else. And it's that opening in mistakes that I find so fascinating, that they're not something that's going to destroy the relationship inherently, but they're something that can make it grow. And that's why I find it necessary that they happen. I'm not, and this is very important, I'm not saying you should make mistakes on purpose. That I think is wrong. Like, that's trying to provoke the patient. But just when it happens, and inevitably will happen, because that's the flow of life, as a therapist you have to take ownership, and you have to try and make it to a point where the patient can learn from it, but you yourself can as well. And I don't think, and at any point in life, we stop learning and growing as people. I think from the first breath to the last, it's a long process of growth. And even though it might be frustrating because there's no end point, it's still something that's very important. And I think that mistakes make us who we are, and how we solve them makes us into other versions of ourselves. When they're not solved, we stagnate. And when they are, we grow. I hope it wasn't too convoluted. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.